Good afternoon and welcome to today's BISG webinar, Right Sizing Your Business. I'm Brian O'Leary, Executive Director of the Book Industry Study Group, and I'm proud to say that we have today with us David Lamb, who's partner at Book Advisors LLC, which provides transaction services and consulting for publishers, as well as David Hetherington, who's Chief Marketing Officer at K&K Software and a member of the BISG Board. David's prepared some materials for, sorry, I should be clear. David Lamb has prepared some materials today to help introduce this idea and provide a perspective that's based upon his significant experience in the transaction side of the business in the publishing industry. And David Hetherington is going to offer some moderated questions to follow. We'll also have time toward the end for any questions that you may have. Please answer them in the questions or put them in the questions box. I'll be monitoring them as we go. And we'll get to them in the last 10 or 15 minutes, depending on the volume of questions. With that, I'd like to turn it over to David Lamb with great thanks. David has done work with us in the past to introduce the merger and acquisitions activity in the book publishing business, and we really appreciate having him back to provide a perspective on this topic.
Brian, thank you very much, and thanks to Mr. Hetherington for being my co-sponsor today, and thanks to BISG for extending the opportunity and allowing us to talk about, what might be a little obscurely or generically titled concept, right-sizing one's business, but we'll try and grapple with the definition of that, and then the application as we walk through a few different aspects of publishing. I should note at the outset that my experience with Susan Reich at Book Advisors does come primarily from the mergers and acquisitions world, and we deal mainly with trade book publishers, so you'll see that bias in our presentation today. Nonetheless, I hope we'll touch on some general principles and operational aspects that have broader applicability. Let's start with the question about what do we mean by right sizing, and I should just say, first of all, that it is not what was reported in the Wall Street Journal, that Amazon, among other companies, were embracing lasting remote unemployment. It's just one of the best and most necessary corrections I've seen in the journal, and I think that it kind of a knee-jerk reaction to what right sizing is would be, how can we take the pruning shears to our staff? And that is so far away from what I want to talk about today. I think it's above my pay grade really to get into HR or personnel or organizational structure decisions, and obviously the pandemic's forced all kinds of companies across all sectors to deal with remote work and make personnel decisions. But I'm gonna stay kind of away from that Pandora's box of reevaluation. My focus today is to try and highlight some aspects of publishing that may be ripe for reevaluation in pursuit of incremental efficiencies. Finally, I should recognize from the outset that right sizing won't be the same for everyone. There's no one right size that fits all. There are differences in operations and markets and sales due to genre, publishing program, distribution, scale, and so forth. So what we'll be walking through today are basically suggested areas of potential improvement. And I'll call the questions we may ask interrogations, but in the kinder and gentler sense of that term. So I want to look at three basic sectors in the quest for right sizing and quest for efficiencies. One are channels of sale. Are there markets that it doesn't make sense for me to serve in the way that I'm currently serving them? Are returns so onerous from certain accounts that they don't, they're undercutting my margins and productivity? Similarly, is there a long tail of accounts that take too much of my CSR time that doesn't necessarily pay off? What contribution do special, gift, library, and other more defined channels play in my access to market? And how do I value those among themselves? So there are a set of, first of all, channel-facing conversations to have. And then I've paired output and production because I think, particularly with the rise of print-on-demand manufacturing, it opens up the idea of how title output and tiers of title output can best be matched with production alternatives, particularly in a world in which digital is growing again, and in which digital processes marry to physical manifestation in the form of POD and short-run digital. And finally, getting to the operations core of the publishing enterprise, I want to ask a little bit of a philosophical question here. What's my value added, my key value added in running a publishing enterprise, in working at a publishing enterprise, and how can I devote more attention to that aspect of the business compared to the perhaps more mundane day-to-day bookkeeping and accounting and shuffling processes that are unfortunately the part of every business. So as I said, I'm trained as an M&A specialist, so I tend to see publishers through the lenses of their P&Ls, and by taking an analytical view of their sales by title and by channel, publisher statements and accounting principles come to us in all kinds of forms and are not necessarily non-conforming. So one of the first projects for when Susan and I have a project is to try and fit it to our Procrustean bed of a quote-unquote normative financial presentation. What you see on the screen is, one iteration of this condensed P&L design, and it's got real-world roots. The small, medium, and large publishers, as well as the resultant average in the leftmost numerical column, stem from our analysis of some real businesses. But my point here is a little more abstract, and actually, just to digress, and because these are narrative nonfiction, mid-list, profile publishers, the peculiarities of that business, relatively high returns and relatively high royalties, come through in all three of the statements and in their rounded average. But I can't go through a presentation without presenting a P&L, but this is, it's a useful tool to think line by line about how a potentially different approach to operations might optimize each line. We aren't going to get into the nuts and bolts of the line items. I present it here as a model. It may or may not conform with your native financial presentation, but it is a pretty good representative of the way we look at things and the way we compare publishers one to another. And I want to take a moment just and look at the operating and Ebitda margins of the very largest English language publishers. As you can see here, we've got PRH, SNS, Hachette, and HarperCollins. And, they're in the band between 9% return on sales and 18% return on sales, an average, raw average of around 14%. In our experience, that's good. Susan and I tend to think about 10% operating income margins as being center of gravity. Some publishers much better, some worse, but 10% is a useful starting point. So looking at even at the largest scale where these global players come out, brackets for me the exercise here, because if we're looking for right sizing, and look, I would take $1 billion revenues as right size any day, but with more modest aims, if we're looking to optimize our business, gaining 1 or 2 margin points is really significant improvement in this industry, which is natively a relatively low margin business compared to the software industry, for instance. So, it's not a quest to become bigger and so efficient that we're at 30% margins, but if we can gain 1, 2, or 3 points by weeding through the P&L and the operations that are attached to each line item, and thinking about how those might be optimized, it's a worthwhile exercise and really what we're on about here. Let's look at sales channels first, and I want to start, as is my want, with a little dense piece of data, but with a really simple and trend that everyone's internalized at this point, which is that Amazon's market power continues to increase, that there's been wholesaler concentration with Ingram gaining share, that in approaching the mass merchants, ReaderLink has continued to consolidate power there. And overall, we're looking at a increasingly consolidated market, and one that is also active even pre-pandemic, right? In terms of online sales and discovery. So as consumer attention, reader attention moves online, it's in a virtuous cycle with the market share buildup around Amazon in particular. And obviously that's ominous, but we can't wring our hands about it. We've got to deal with it. And one of the questions of the right sizing exercise is, well, how do we optimize our sales in that market? And conversely, it behooves us to look at the other market sectors as well. It's heartening, right, to see indie booksellers hanging in at 5% and special sales hanging in. And it was surprising to me actually to see international sales at above 10%, really consistently strong. So there are other channels that are persistent and strong, but don't necessarily carry the same weight they once did. And the question becomes, how do I make sure I'm not leaving the smaller accounts behind, but that I'm not spending too much time servicing them, or that they're creating inefficiencies in my sales and marketing operation. Again, not to put too fine a point on it, but with the pandemic, Amazon's share, digital and print, rose even after their April de-emphasis of books. For the first 7 months of this year, it rose to 50%, half the market. Hopefully James Dawn, who's I think very eloquent 10 days ago on the BISG cast, about his hopes to rationalize and turn around B&N's fortunes through better operations, better buying, lower returns, and so forth. Hopefully that will come to fruition, but but in the situation we're in right now, we have to deal with a very dominant player, and we have to continue to deal with returns. Of course, this is a chart that ends in 2017, just based on the data set we used to pull this together. And there's been some reduction overall in returns experience in that period and since. But it's still problematic, and it's more volatile, the degree to which the resellers can move bulk books. So this is not a problem for every publisher, but the calibration of how long a leash, how much inventory you consign to Walmart or B&N or any or Target becomes a real issue and can wreak havoc in your cash flows. It can pay off incredibly handsomely as well, but there are dangers here, and there is no lack of application of the reseller's market power to your disadvantage if that is the way the ball rolls. So we've got a consolidating and still volatile industry. We've got the trends accentuated in the pandemic. And that raises questions. Some of the key interrogations might be, with sales and discovery increasingly online, how do we optimize those sales? Amazon is increasingly both, obviously it's a marketplace for goods, but it is also an ad-driven marketplace, a marketplace for advertising in a way similar to the way Google operates. And there are publishers out there who are extremely successful in treating it as such and creating sales for their books through aggressive marketing. Not that it proves the point, but a client of ours had treated Amazon as a ship-to-fill account, basically, had done no advertising, and in their past year, they just said, well, let's look at some keyword promotion, and sales tripled. So there's even with relatively modest inputs, with some marketing attention in the online marketplace. And as Brian O'Leary will tell you, it is imperative, of course, to have your metadata in order and flex that. And just in general, it's imperative at this point for publishers to know how to sell aggressively online. On the other hand, particularly with the hiatus in physical retail, what accounts might be moved to lower priority service? We typically see, when we see a client's account list, their direct accounts, we see 10 important ones and a long tail as long as 100 or 500 de minimis accounts. And I think the question needs to be asked, is that publisher devoting too much attention to to some of those lower return accounts. Is gift representation effective? It absolutely may be, but I think it requires management. It's not just an autonomous activity. It requires management attention and might need to be recalibrated. And finally, with the conundrum of returns continuing, are there returns heavy accounts that need to be rationed or otherwise kind of brought to heel to some degree? So those are some of the interrogations in the market-facing side. Let's turn to output and production, and output in terms of number of titles produced and type of titles produced is always a delicate issue. Susan and I get asked at least once a year, and this is not a question I'm going to repeat in the quest of right sizing, but why don't you just publish the bestsellers? And which is, of course, an absurd question, always coming from outside the industry. And because as we've internalized, right, like many creative endeavors, publishing relies on a portfolio approach, a portfolio of titles, which will have different levels of success. I twinned output and production here because I'm thinking of the examination here as a question of matching opportunity with investment. I know I want to publish my A-list titles with full support, but is there a better way to match my C-tier titles with release strategy and production method? And this is not a new question, right? This stratification has been taking place for a long time. Pocketbooks, trade paper originals, digital first publication. But there are new features and new capabilities that may allow publishers to take a more complex view of their list and its production requirements. Let's acknowledge just quickly that digital ebooks and digital audio is a permanent component of the landscape here, and that was, of course, shown in its essence in the spike in ebook sales in the no contact period of the pandemic. So these charts just show kind of a state of play of ebooks and the growth in downloaded audio. And the conclusion I draw here is every publisher should be represented in both of those formats, and backlists should be licensed or self-published into audio, and of course ebooks if there are print-only editions left, to take advantage of this wave. But I think the most interesting digital enablement at the current day is really print on demand. The ability to print a single book rather than an offset print run of 500 or 1,000 or 30,000 copies. Print on demand technology has caught up in terms of production values, certainly for black and white and for all but highly designed titles. There is a lot more capacity. Capacity has been instituted globally to enable frictionless international sales. And It can also be iterated as digital short run printing, right? Where rather than spitting out one title to a single requested customer, you stockpile 200 or 300 digitally printed copies to satisfy anticipated demand. It's a facet of production that is growing. You know, our quick look on the bar chart shows that one aspect of one vendor looks to be doubling every 3 years. The pandemic has goosed that growth. Ingram is very is the market leader with Lightning Source, and also makes a point of the fact that in addition to that one key benefit of POD is guaranteed availability. If you're on a POD platform, your book can be printed and shipped even if offset stock is depleted. And with crimps in offset capacity, a very real feature of the second half 2020 printing landscape, that's all the more important. So looking at matching output to production, what role can POD play? You know, are there titles, maybe those down the list, that should be released as ebooks with optional POD availability? You know, does that constrain them to online only purchase, or does is bookstore stockage important? Looking at how much press time I can get, how is that going to affect my desire to have titles printed or available on POD? And you know, as I look down my list, there are just titles that my C-tier titles that should be demand-driven print runs rather than title P&L driven print runs. And finally, there's an aspect here which goes to capital and total cost of ownership. POD costs are higher, unit cost basis, and the industry historically has a very unit cost orientation to establishing print runs. But as we've seen in the model P&Ls, it also has an obsolescence issue. I don't think we've ever say, well, it's not quite true. Susan and I have seen a few companies that are under inventoried. Routinely, we see companies that are way over inventoried. And looked at from a total capital deployment standpoint, POD may be a really excellent tool to right size your balance sheet. Finally, let's look at the operation of the publishing house itself, processes, office, marketing, and infrastructure. As I said at the top, I'm really not looking at personnel per se. That's a much more question that an overview could treat. And look, you know, in general, I'd say there's not a lot of excess bureaucracy impeding small to medium-sized publishers. Most publishers are pretty lean and mean. So as we hunt for efficiencies, this is on the same template, same P&L template, but now posits a typical $10 million publisher and looks at the hypothetical by having a lower returns profile, less inventory obsolescence, and more efficient back office operations, including perhaps lower facilities. Could a smaller incarnation of that publisher actually make more money? And the short answer is potentially, yes. it could also stay the same size and potentially make more money. And that I think is the gist of the right sizing gauntlet, is to go down and figure out what's the right size of my sales and list, my production operation, and then my internal operation. And of course, you know, the pandemic has just brought particularly the office operations questions to the fore. I think it's useful to step back and think about what's the specific value added that makes my publisher successful. You know, is it my editorial curation? Is it my ability to match specific market segments to appropriate titles and sell them effectively? Is there a design component that makes my titles attractive? Is there a topical focus or genre focus that creates reputation among booksellers and consumers? You know, these are the reasons publishers have sprouted and the reasons they survive and flourish. Probably not so much because they're really super good at royalty accounting or vendor statement reconciliation or bookkeeping or processing 1099s or and so forth. You know, these are more likely to be pain points than they are points of pride. And so I think as we look at the different aspects of the P&L, each one needs to be interrogated as to whether it is a contributor to the key goal and key value added of the enterprise, or whether it is something that might better be outsourced or brought in on some plug and play basis. It doesn't necessarily mean outsource though, right? It could be that creating a different role in source might be the best solution to the diversity of social media marketing and author management and so forth needed. You know, I'm agnostic about that, but to examine marketing, operations, facilities, virtualization options, workforce, all this, obviously the pandemic has created a jump ball for this kind of review and examination, and any or all elements of it could well help improve the right sizing of your business. So worth looking at. David and Brian, that's the end of my prepared remarks, as they say, and happy to converse.
Okay, well,
thank you, Dave. And maybe I could invite the two of you to turn your video on so that you can have a conversation back and forth. And David, if you leave your slides up for a bit, if people want to refer back to any of the components, David or the audience can do that.
okay. So David, if perhaps we can jump, I've made some notes on some of the fabulous slides that you prepared. And if we could go back to slide number 5, which I think was the opening P&L slide, that would be great. So a couple of questions for you, and as someone who is in a 12-step program for recovering accountants, perhaps I'm going to ask a couple of technical questions. So one of the things I'm curious about is whether or not in your M&A work, you find that many of your clients have a good handle on the profitability of individual customer relationships, the profitability of individual distribution channels, and the profitability of individual product lines?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it would be great to have everyone have their finger on those pulses. Look, in practice, and maybe as a function of the scale of clients we normally deal with at the lower end of the scale, it's pretty rare to see that sort of analysis done crisply. It's rare to see a frontlist contribution, backlist contribution analysis. More likely, the analysis we tend to see, and to some degree we tend to foment a little bit, are around what's the stratification of the list? What are the genres or the series or the authors who are really driving the publishing company? But that inquiry is normally normally ends with sales and doesn't get down to through cost of goods on a segmented basis to contribution analysis.
Okay, so, but in that same vein, right, so at a couple of points during today's conversation, you mentioned COVID-19, certainly an irresistible reality for all of us here, but let's assume that there is some sort of a resurgence. Do you see a difference in the ability of a publisher's ability to weather round two if they've shifted their emphasis from fixed to variable expenses?
I mean, I think clearly, to the degree that companies have taken advantage of the current tragedy to reduce their fixed operating costs, that's going to be, that's a proper survival instinct and is going to help. Similarly, if they've made their production arrangements more variable, right? If they're able to shift more to print on demand, if they're going to be more reliant on ebook sales, and maybe the prudent thing, if wave two is a obviously, unfortunately, it's a possibility, but if you are looking at it as a likelihood, then it's, I think, a really hard question in terms of what do you do with your print runs between now and, say, next March. Those are difficult enough resets anyway, given the continued spotty access to retail and the offset constraints. But so I think generally, right, as a principle, it makes sense. I think its actual implementation is not going to be a panacea.
Right. Okay. So, but there is another interesting point that you brought up, and that, of course, is the role of Amazon in all of this. And let us say, if there is, God forbid, a round two, and Amazon again shifts its focus away from books to consumer goods, right? Have you seen publishers recognize the risk that this presents and make investments in building their own online sales and delivery capabilities? Or are you still seeing publishers sort of keeping their fingers crossed that Amazon will support the book business in the way they've traditionally done?
Right. Well, I think, I think from the majors on down, everyone's tried, right? And to establish not only a direct consumer, direct to reader marketing relationship, but also an actual ordering relationship. I think the former has been more successful than the latter, right? The consumer orders are still tending to run via the most frictionless conduit, which is Amazon. But I think there are glimmers from third parties, right? Bookshop is a great innovation and boon, and Andy Hunter had just extraordinarily good timing, and as he does in introducing that in February, and now expanding to the UK. So that's a solution, and in terms of marketing, publishers can take advantage of that, right? You can have your not only can a bookshop have a retailer have a presence there with a selection available for order, but publishers can as well. From here in Portland, the new epicenter of American unrest and wildfires and so forth. Powell's has been challenged, obviously, and shuttered until recently, but it's been fulfilling. So I think there are still intermediary paths to market that are not Amazon. That said, I don't know of any great success stories for publishers selling, directly to readers at small scale or at a large scale. A company like J Novel Club has had an interesting uptake of its reader club, but I think you've got to do both, right? We've got to keep trying, but at the same time, we've got to flex the levers as best we can at Amazon as well.
Okay, so so a question now about perhaps the less exciting side of the business, and that is book manufacturing. As you may know, there have been some what I would describe as watershed events in the past several months. What do you think the industry, do you think the industry is taking the appropriate steps, or your clients are taking the appropriate steps to protect themselves in a market with shrinking manufacturing capacity?
Yeah, the throughput at many of our clients is small enough that we haven't heard any screams yet. And we haven't heard, the need to do some open field running to get production changed. There's been some, but it hasn't been. Some of what we've heard is actually tariff related, right? So if we go into, 4 more years of the same, then there'll just be more disruption layered on, particularly for illustrated publishers.
Okay.
But coming back to, offset constraint, so we haven't heard the screams, but obviously the constraint is having real world impact and resetting release schedules for this fall. I'm hopeful that Atlas, who seems to be a good steward and a builder of the industrial enterprises they take ownership of, that could really benefit LSC and keep it in the game, even as Quad, slowly recedes.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. Brian, do we have questions from the audience?
Thanks. We have a few, and I'm sure you have others as well. One question Barry Cohn asked, if you could talk a little bit more about what's included in the cost of ownership of a book. You talked about total cost of ownership, but I think you meant, for example, manufacturing costs plus cost of carrying inventory, capital costs, plus any spoilage, et cetera.
Right. I mean, all those things, I think are the visible capital carrying costs for having a book in stock. There are other front-loaded costs, right? Author advance, which is relatively high in the examples on slide 6. And your mileage may vary there considerably. But the customs, the freight end, all those costs sit as capital investment until unit by unit the books are sold, and that cost is relieved on a P&L basis, and the sale frees up the cash that was stored like carbon, and I guess in carbon to some degree in those books. So I think your rundown, Brian, or the questionnaires rundown actually captured most of the elements. So what are there invisible elements as well? It takes more effort to manage a distended inventory than it does a tight inventory. I think that's right, and I think what we've seen tend to happen is there's inventory bloat, and there's periodic analysis about whether or not we're in an overstock position on Title A or Title B. And often that gets punted, particularly for self-distributed clients. For clients working through a distributor, distributors are increasingly exacting in terms of overstock calculations and fees. So some of the overstock cost is being disciplined back to the publisher by the distributor, but that that doesn't always lead to pulping on a direct basis. So
because at that moment you're recognizing obsolescence, and that's a write-off as well.
Correct.
Yeah. Right. This is on a go ahead, David. Sorry. Oh wait.
I mean, not that the business is completely predictable, right? Obviously, it's not crawdads. It's a serendipitous and sometimes frustrating business, but recognizing inventory obsolescence in your income statement is a delayed recognition of cash that was misspent, right? So.
Yep. There's in a different category, and since you have the representative P&L up on the slide, the first part of the question is, where does rights licensing and permission revenue fall in this, if at all? Is that other income?
Yes. Just to answer that quickly, in terms of the statement, it's in other income, and it's so it's pretty compressed here in this portrayal.
Okay, and if the ability to improve rights revenue, I think you were trying to figure out later in the presentation, it's just provoking publishers to think about whether an investment in that area or some other way of managing it might be important. We currently have a study and work that will be released or described next week on Tuesday about the return on investment in managing rights revenue. So companies that provide support, K&K Software is one of them, but we have several other companies, including Ingenta and Virtue Sales and Fidel, who are sponsoring that paper. it might be it's a good opportunity potentially for publishers to take that relatively small contribution and improve it.
Agreed. I think the easy, the low-hanging fruit there are ebook implementation of rights that haven't been deployed yet, audiobook licensing, again, of rights that have been captured in author contracts that haven't been licensed or deployed. I'm less familiar with kind of the foreign rights market generally, but it would seem that with the, it'll be interesting to see what Frankfurt's like this year as a virtual forum, and what what efficiencies, what new technologies can be brought to bear in just connecting that worldwide network a bit better. Same time, POD may undercut that a little bit by making English language titles more broadly available in non-English speaking markets.
So essentially moving it out of the rights transaction and more just you published it in a given market.
Yeah, I mean, if you've got world English in the author contract, yes.
Yeah.
Brian, can I just raise a question here? It just occurred to me that, David, if you had to name 2 operational functions that you think every publisher should outsource, would you feel comfortable doing that? And what are they?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I'm going to speak from my brief publishing experience as well. So, and it's down in the SG&A category. I think a little bit dependent on scale, but I think with online bookkeeping, I think bookkeeping and accounting per se should really, can really fruitfully be removed from the office domain to an outsource. Where the cutoff is on that in terms of accounts receivable and accounts payable processing, I think that's going to vary, but the actual statement preparation and bookkeeping and journal entry, I just feel there are better people than on-board publishers to do that. I may be betraying my relatively small publisher client cohort, but my view generated from them, but that's my one nomination.
You realize, of course, that I mentioned I was in a 12-step recovery program, and you just pushed me back over the edge. But
yeah, I'm sorry about that.
But separately,
it's parlous times. You've got to do what you've got to do. I mean, do you agree? Do you think that's as a recovering CPA, is that a kind of a valid observation?
Yeah, I think it's a matter of the scale, and I think it's also a matter of the sophistication. I think one needs to make a distinction between accounting and finance, right? So there's an analytical component that should absolutely be with the publisher, but the bookkeeping piece, I think that you have something there that's worth considering about moving that out. The other piece, I think, just from my own experience with the 2 pieces where I would be looking is for information technology and warehousing. I think, those are 2 pieces now where, work from home environment, managing that process for technology, it is perhaps best done by somebody with scale rather than a small publisher. And warehousing with uncertainty now, I don't know why anybody would want to be bearing the burden of a building and the staff and everything that goes along with it.
Yeah, I completely agree as to the warehousing. Again, we deal mainly with publishers who have full service distribution by a third party, by Ingram or one of the majors. So we tend to see that as almost a given, but there are plenty of publishers that are hanging on to the 50,000 square feet next door, and that really needs to be examined.
David, there's a couple of questions related to on-demand. One, the value of the models like the espresso book machine, so POD at retail, and is there promise there? And the second part of that question is kind of the opposite. Would it make sense for major publishers to take some of or all of its POD in-house by buying the digital equipment?
Both really good questions at opposite ends of the scale. And, you know, I, just being honest here, I've kind of lost track of the espresso as, you know, a driver of retail activity or foot traffic. And that's obviously problematic here in the pandemic. I just don't know if that's proven to be a useful tool for resellers to, for retailers to produce one-by-ones to serve their customers in this interregnum. You know, on the other hand, at the very top end of the scale, at the $1 million, you know, investment, I'm also not sure. I think that could well make sense at the largest sizes, and it makes sense for distributors of a certain scale, right? IPG took over some of Edward Brothers' POD capability, so you would think the curve would operate so that it would make sense for PRH to have POD in Westminster if it does for IPG and so forth. But I just don't know the status of those implementations.
Yeah, thank you. David, I think that about covers it on our side. Do you have a closing question or a thought that you might want to share with David Lamb?
For the moment, no, but other than to say, David, thank you for another brilliant presentation. We've worked together on several of these, and you always do a remarkable job. And it's you know, a pleasure to be a part of these events that you steer us through. Thanks very much for your time.
Well, you're too kind, David. Brian and David both. You know, it's a pleasure, and we'll look forward to an M&A wrap up. You know, at the top of the year, if we actually make it as a society and industry to 2021. Looking forward to that.
Okay. I'll thank you for having listened to my conversation with James Stott last week. That was it was certainly a very good conversation. I'm glad that we had you in the audience.
Very good. No, it was a really good conversation. So both of you keep up the good work and appreciate the opportunity as always.
All right. Talk to you again soon. Thank you, David, and Excellent. Thank you, David Hetherington.
My pleasure. Thank you. Bye-bye now.
Okay.